Seems like the victim was dressed as the leprechaun from Lucky Charms. So I guess you could say, got a serial killer on our hands. What is up, guys? So today we are back with another deep dive. Today we're actually looking at a Pokemon that's had a lot of attention in these first couple of weeks. And I definitely say that looking into a versus video beforehand definitely did fuel a lot of the research in this video in particular. So this one may be a little faster than normal. If you want to see the versus video on Hypno, I definitely encourage you to go back. It was just released a few days ago, Hypno versus Chimecho, to kind of get a wider scope of Hypno. We're going to try to go a little bit deeper into Hypno himself in this video, so let's get that going. So Hypno, being our subject today, is a pure psychic type Pokemon. At level 40 with 15s across the board, you can actually hit 2090 CP, which is pretty nice, especially for Great League. Maxing out pretty low on the scale, closer to that 1500 number, is really, really good. You can actually achieve a 1500 with a 0 on attack, 13 defense, and 13 stamina. At level 28, you will actually achieve a even 1500 on the CP. Now, according to my spreadsheets and all the numbers that I run, Hypno does rank 3rd in bulk and 3rd in stat product, which is pretty high. In the versus video, I did say 13th. Totally don't know what I was saying there, but definitely 3rd in bulk and 3rd in stat product. Now, his actual base stats are really, really nice for PvP. So we have a 144 attack, 193 defense, and 198 stamina, which is really what you kind of want to see whenever you build a Pokemon up for PvP. This lower attack stat means that we're going to be able to get more of our stat product drawn out of our Pokemon, because the CP formula is just so heavily weighted towards the attack stat that a lower attack stat ends up being huge. Moving on to our moves here. So I did exclude a few of the moves in this list just because I knew I was going to run on a whiteboard. Hypno actually has 7 different moves in his entire move pool. 2 fast moves with 5 charge moves. He's had quite the treatment when it comes to move changes. And I only have Confusion written up here simply because Confusion trumps Zen Headbutt in every scenario that I can honestly think of. So Zen Headbutt is 2 energy for 2.67 damage. After stab, it does go up to 3.2, but Confusion is 3 energy for 4 damage with 4.8 after stab. So it's just better in every regard. More energy gain, more damage, no problem there. Now, in terms of our charge moves though, I decided to exclude Psychic. So Psychic is 70 energy for 100 damage, which is a 1.43 damage per energy ratio. After you factor in stab, it does go up to 120 damage for a 1.71 damage per energy ratio, but still, compared to Future Sight and Psyshock, it's just non-comparable. I mean, honestly, Psyshock, even though it's legacy at this point, it's still, in my opinion, miles ahead of Psychic. It has a better ratio all around. It doesn't quite do as much damage, but it's way more efficient, which I just feel is a better choice. Future Sight, on the other hand, is even more efficient, which is why I decided to choose it as the other one to include here. So let's actually go over these charge moves really fast. So yet again, Psyshock is legacy, but for 45 energy, you'd get 70 damage at a 1.56 damage per energy ratio. After you factor in stab, you do go up to 84 damage, which brings your ratio up to a 1.86. Now, we also do have Shadow Ball, which is 55 energy to fire for 100 damage at a 1.82. Considering that Shadow Ball is a ghost type attack, of course we won't get a stab bonus there. Focus Blast, also not a stab candidate. 75 energy will get you 150 damage at a 2.0 damage per energy ratio. Future Sight here is our last move. For 65 energy, you get 120 damage at 1.85 damage per energy ratio. After you factor in stab though, damage does go up to 144 for a 2.21 damage per energy ratio. That's insane. That's big. That's a big, big number. So out of all of these moves, so there's kind of an interesting way to build Hypno. You can build Hypno basically with Confusion, Shadow Ball, and Focus Blast, which is exactly what I did in the Versus video with Chimecho. I still honestly do believe that is our best bet when it comes to a moveset, but if you actually have Side Shock on your Hypno, don't get rid of it for any reason. I honestly wouldn't even... I mean, so the thing is if you have Shadow Ball and Focus Blast, you're basically covering all of the typings. Like, you have an out for the dark types, you have an out for the psychic types, and you have an out for the fighting types. So you kind of have an out for everything. But if you ended up having Side Shock, or even if you want to go Future Sight and Focus Blast, since both of those aren't legacy at this point, you just kind of still get to utilize Hypno and put a lot of pressure on your opponent, because I guarantee everybody is going to be feeling like Hypno is going to be huge. I mean, at the Kingdom Cup that I just came off of yesterday, I mean, it was insane how much people were already talking about Hypno. Like, hey man, do you got a Hypno? Does it have Shadow Ball? Do you have Side Shock? You know, what do you got? Like, people were already trying to farm out that trade. But if you ended up trying to run Hypno with Confusion, Future Sight, and even Focus Blast, so all you're going to end up having to do is more narrowly focus your Hypno target to the fighting type, and with Focus Blast force some of the dark type matchups to be a little awkward. But the problem is that Hypno, being pure psychic, falls to dark types really, really hard, and we'll get into that when we get over to these matches over here. But you do, if you can farm energy in certain matchups and then you go up against a dark type, you can basically just whip out a Focus Blast, especially against things like Alolan Raticate, which are going to take huge damage to a fighting type move, and a ton of the other darks that are going to have problems with it as well. You kind of give yourself a fighting chance if your back's up against the wall. Now, you can't farm that energy off of a dark match from the get-go. If I lead with Hypno and my opponent leads with a dark Pokemon, it's going to be a really hard time. I'm probably not even going to get to that Focus Blast before I can get it off, and even if I do, they would know to use a shield. So it's kind of a farmable move. Like, you don't want to use it unless you can farm it off of another Pokemon. But in either case, for this scenario, we are going to take into account Confusion, Shadow Ball, and Focus Blast for all of the simulations behind me. So let's actually get into some shields here. So in a 0 versus 0 shield situation, so in a mock-up closing type situation, I have no shields, my opponent doesn't have any shields either. We actually end up winning 61.2% of our matchups. That's pretty big. I mean, when shields are down, 61% isn't too bad in this meta. 66% means that we would have 2/3 of the entire meta covered, so we're not too far off of that. Our next scenario is actually going to be 2 shields versus 0 shields. When I have 2 shields and my opponent doesn't have any shields, we actually end up winning 95.5% of those matchups. But that's actually not the ones that I'm concerned about. In this scenario, I actually want to know which Pokemon I just flat out end up losing to. If I have 2 shields and my opponent doesn't have any, which Pokemon are just going to be able to kill me no matter how much shield advantage I have? Well, there's 3 Pokemon in particular here, and one of them is just mind-boggling, but Sharpedo actually makes this list for some crazy reason. Sharpedo is on this list of Pokemon that can beat our Hypno with no shields. Spiritomb and Umbreon also appear in this list, both very, very highly regarded dark type Pokemon, so those two make a lot of sense. Sharpedo was kind of a surprise to see, but hey, Sharpedo, he's doing it. He's doing it. So our next scenario is actually 0 shields versus 2 shields. So when I don't have any shields and my opponent actually has 2 shields, I actually end up winning 26.9% of those matchups. And we're actually concerned with which ones we do win here, because that means that even though they have complete shield advantage, I can still take them out. And out of those Pokemon, most of them are fighting types. So basically, most of the fighting types actually end up falling to Hypno whenever we're using this Confusion fast move, because Confusion has insane amount of damage for a decent, quite good amount of energy per turn. But we also end up actually winning against both Wobbuffet and Drowsy, for what it's worth. Now our last scenario is actually a 2 shields versus 2 shields. So in a mock-up like lead-off situation, we actually end up winning 46.3% of those matchups. So what does that tell us about our Hypno? Well, for me, that tells us that Hypno actually does prefer to close here. It likes to be able to throw out whatever moves it has, and I feel like that's because whenever we're having Shadow Ball and Focus Blast, we're basically, both of those moves, I mean, Shadow Ball is not nearly as hard to get to as Focus Blast, but both of them are pretty high in regards to how much energy we need to fire them off. Of course, Shadow Ball being 55, that's not too bad. For 3 energy per turn, that means we're going to get there in roughly 20 turns, so roughly 10 seconds, a little bit less than 10 seconds, but I mean, that's still quite a long time to get to that. So we basically have one shot to fire off, and if they have shields, we do really like want them to not have shields for Hypno to get through a ton of its damage. So let's actually move on to some matchups here. So in all of my deep dives, I end up taking our subject Pokemon Hypno today, and I end up throwing them up against the top 10 bulkiest Pokemon in the cup just to kind of see how we do. All of the simulations ran from this side of the board, and basically from this point until the end of the video, all of these simulations are run with 1 shield versus 1 shield to kind of get the most even sense of matchups that we possibly can. So as far as our top 10 goes, we actually end up winning a lot of these. Hypno does, of course, appear in the top 10 bulk. As we saw over here, it does actually appear 3rd. So I decided not to include him. Poliwrath ends up making up the 10th spot, being the 11th bulkiest Pokemon here. So Wobbuffet, Claydol, Metang, Slowbro, Slowking, Grumpig, and Poliwrath all end up falling to our Hypno. Now Metang is an interesting one. So I did run the Metang matchup with both of its fast moves, and in either case we do end up winning, but if Metang actually ends up choosing to use Zen Headbutt, then we actually win by a pretty big margin. We actually end with 83 health left. If we actually go up against a Metang that runs Metal Claw though, all that neutral damage does make up a huge difference here. We actually only win with 1 HP left on Hypno. So in a real world scenario, that's pretty trivial. I mean, it could end up being a tie. It could end up being a couple of different things depending on how, how the servers are feeling that day for you. But in terms of simulations, you do still win with 1 HP. In practice, it may go a little different. Results may vary. Now, as far as what we end up losing to, so these are pretty much obvious, I guess. Umbreon, Bronzong, and Alolan Raticate all end up having a field day with us here. Now, Bronzong is kind of the awkward one. So Bronzong, as we know, can resist a ton of psychic damage, but it actually has access to Feint Attack on its fast moves. So I did do both simulations. With Feint Attack, it's just clear cut. It easily wins up against the Hypno. But the thing is, if Bronzong actually ends up using Confusion instead, which I do feel like some people may end up running that, we actually end up tying, which is very interesting. So it does look like Hypno actually gets off Shadow Ball just a bit faster than Bronzong can get off the Heavy Slam, but both of those are shielded in the 1v1 shield scenario. So then it's a race to see who can get to their next charge move faster, but after only 4 more turns after Bronzong hits that Heavy Slam, he can actually fire off Flash Cannon at the exact same turn that Hypno actually ends up getting Shadow Ball, and then 1 more fast attack from both Pokemon on the next following turn ends up tying. So Bronzong will be a definite trivial matchup whether you tie or lose. Personally, for me, I count a tie as a loss. I lost my Pokemon, so that's what that means for me. Now let's actually move on to some counters here. So our counters are pretty cut and dry here. Psychic is a little wonky, but we'll get through that. So as far as what we should actually be using our Hypno for, we actually want to be using it for the fighting types. In 1v1 shield scenarios, we only end up tying with Lucario. We beat every other fighting Pokemon, flat out. But we do tie with that Lucario, so that's kind of important to remember. Now, as far as our Psychics go, we actually end up beating the pure Psychics. And what I mean by that is Pokemon that don't have access to neutral moves to actually combat the Psychic resistance that Hypno will carry with its own typing. So, if these Pokemon only have access to Zen Headbutt or Extrasensory or anything like that, they end up having a really hard time because we can basically just get to that Shadow Ball and just pummel them. Plus, our Confusion does huge damage even even though it's going to be resisted, if it does any less damage than Confusion does right off the bat, they're at a bigger disadvantage than Hypno, so we end up overcoming those psychic matchups in particular. Now, on the other side of the cloth, what we should actually be focusing on bringing to combat the Hypno, the psychic types that end up having neutral matchups, things that are like Legacy Starmie with Quick Attack does really good, Alolan Raichu does really good, Xatu does really good. All these Pokemon that have access to different types of move besides the psychics and can actually do neutral damage while resisting that damage, it's crazy. Those Pokemon do really, really well up against Hypno, and they actually end up beating us in most scenarios. So, if you're looking at what to bring against Hypno, definitely consider some psychics that have access to neutral moves if you do feel like Hypno is going to be a problem in your area. But the even safer move is just to bring a dark type, because in a 1 versus 1 shield scenario, there is not a single dark type that we can actually beat. All of them, every single one of them, actually end up beating us, and that's really crappy. But like I said earlier in the video, if you have those matchups where you can basically farm out energy to get a hold of this Focus Blast over here, this does kind of go a little differently. You can kind of fake them out, hopefully get them to not shield the Focus Blast in some kind of scenario and end up hitting them hard. You'll actually end up overcoming that dark type matchup pretty well. Now, last but not least here, let's actually go over a few pros and cons for our Hypno. So, I talked a little bit about it in the Versus video, a little more than I'm going to here, because it's really, really hard to think up different things that Hypno is actually good for and bad for. So the only con that I can actually still think of to this day is that this Hypno with this exact moveset used for this video is extremely difficult to find. A Shadow Ball Hypno is pretty rough. Like, I think I said it in the Versus video, but like when I got back into Pokemon Go, none of my group even had like more than 3 Drowsy candy, like period. We were all like severely in a Drowsy drought. Like we had no Hypnos whatsoever. So in your area, it may have been a little different. Maybe there were nests that carried Drowsy back in the day. Was that a thing? It's gonna be kind of hard to find. I think there was one guy at the Kingdom Cup that actually said that he had one with Shadow Ball. He said that he traded for it, but I mean, even then, that's one guy out of 17. So there's kind of an anecdotal type odds. I mean, it's gonna be kind of rough to find. But if you have one, it does perform really, really well. And that's kind of the pro to the video, is that Hypno has some really, really strong matchups. Like, he's got a lot going for him. Up against the fighting types, it's usually like no problem. There are certain scenarios where Lucario can get the Shadow Ball. If he farms off of another matchup, maybe, then possibly Shadow Ball is going to catch you off guard. But in general sense, all the fighting types are pretty easy. The dark types, pretty hard. That's where your big weakness is, and that's pretty obvious. It's this rock, paper, scissors meta that is really being driven home by doing these deep dives in the last few days, that just rock, paper, scissors is how this is going to go. I have been thinking recently about the team building video that I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, and honestly this meta is probably going to be a really easy one to go over because of how just rock, paper, scissors it is. I mean, honestly, like, if you just had 2 darks, 2 fightings, 2 psychics, you've pretty much got tons of coverage. It's all about which 2 darks, which 2 fightings, and which 2 psychics should you really bring. So that is actually my take on Hypno, guys. Thanks so much for hanging out. Thanks so much for watching. I really do appreciate you guys coming and hanging out. Of course, if you guys have any suggestions on deep dives, please leave them down in the comments below. I'll be happy to add them to the spreadsheet. I may actually get rid of the whole spreadsheet idea and just make like a straw poll or something like that. We may do that next month, because the spreadsheet's really hard to keep up with, and it's not as clean as I wish it could be. But either way, Thank you guys so much for hanging out. Always remember, if you like to like videos, make sure you do that. If you don't, you could be that guy. Otherwise, let me know what you have to say down in the comments below. And until our next video, I will catch you then.